going to start with the Jungian side of things. And so we'll make our favorite diagram here. And here's that dividing wall, or that membrane that separates the ego from the unconscious. Okay. Now, we saw that in Jung's life, from his very earliest years, he was fascinated by these psychic images that were emerging out of the unconscious. And so when he began to develop his science of the psyche, a science based on those images, it went something like this. He would study the various images, and then he would hypothesize that these images must have originated from somewhere deep in the psyche. All over the world, he would see the same idea appearing in various images, the same structural idea. And so, through many years of work, he eventually delineates various features that he imagines exist down here in the psyche. It takes him even more work to finally begin to see that there's some kind of dynamic relationship between these factors down here. In other words, the archetypes themselves go together into some kind of organic process that he calls the process of individuation. So what's happening is that Jung is going everywhere he can, literally. He will go to his own dreams, the dreams of his patients. He will go to the material coming up in psychotics. He will go to ancient myths. He spent many years studying alchemy. And at first you say, well, alchemy, I mean, that's just these guys who didn't know chemistry. And what possible use could that be to... But he saw that they weren't trying to do chemistry as we understand it. Not just that, but they were doing these processes that were supposed to lead naturally to the production of gold. But there was a whole psychological side to it. They were projecting on these outer processes some of these inner psychological contents. And because they were doing that, in their writings, he could see a whole anticipation of modern psychology. And that's really pleased him, because then he would have a kind of historical base for his own psychology, because they were discovering some of the same things but veiled under their various stages of the alchemical process. Like they would have a stage that was equivalent to what he was to later call this confrontation with the shadow and things like that. Okay, so we have the world of images, which Jung is saying these images are real, inasmuch as they exist in the psyche and they affect us. And from the images, we are deducing the existence of these deep structures in the psyche, structures that apparently all of us have all over the world. These don't have, the deep structures don't have anything to do with culture and personal history. They have to do with the very nature, we could put it, of the psyche, though I don't think Jung would use that word. All right, so what emerges here is a picture of these deep levels of the psyche and how they're connected and how there's a dynamic movement. and how these archetypes are not just generating images, but it's as if they're surrounded by energy. Call it emotional energy or psychic energy or whatever you want to call it, but they're not just like static lying there like some little stone, but they're like some crystal that is pulsating with all this energy and light. And Jung felt that this ego, our ego consciousness here, was connected with all this in one system, even energetically, so that energy would flow into the consciousness and it would flow back into the unconscious. And so there were the whole dynamics of psychic energy. Now, what we ended up doing about Jung last night was simply to say, okay, this is what Jung's doing. What are some of the basic ways we too can see what he's doing, almost verify it for ourselves, get in touch with the unconscious? And we did that by talking about dreams, because dreams are more of the dreams appear here at this borderline. The same way if you're going to sleep and you're just as you close your eyes and you're about to drift off, you can have these images flash in front of your eyes. They're called hypnagogic images. Or some people who are gifted in imagery can just close their eyes and relax and see very vivid images. They just pop up from the unconscious if we sort of turn down the light here. Consciousness acts sort of like a bright light, and while it's on full force, it tends to obscure what's appearing on the screen. But if we turn down the light enough, then what appears on the screen between conscious and unconscious, those pictures begin to become more lively. To get off a little on a tangent, when people do drugs, certain kinds of drugs, it's not like the drugs are producing the imagery. I believe the drugs are affecting their brain, dimming the lights here, so to speak, on certain parts of the brain, and allowing them to perceive the imagery that's in a way already there. Okay? You have only to get into one of those situations where you go to sleep and you're either in a strained situation or there's a lot of energy going around, and you have dreams that you begin to remember. You wake up and you say, wow, where did all that come from? It's just another one of those images indicating that there's a tremendous life going on down here. Okay, now, the other thing we touched on quite a bit was the fact that these centers of energy, okay, if we don't find a way to connect with them, somehow realize they're there and give them their due, they almost become swollen with energy. All right? There's no channel for that energy to come up into consciousness. They become swollen with energy, and then they have to find a way to express themselves. The pressure builds up, and they come out, and they appear in the outer world in the form of what Jung would call projection. They attach themselves, for example, to other people. And so that we think that the person we are really angry with is the only reason we're angry. And yet, many times, our anger has some component from inside ourselves. And we realize that too sometimes. We have a glimpse that, gee, you know, I'm losing it, and I'm really going to destroy this person. You know, I'm ready to throttle them, and it's not just them. There's something more going on. Okay. We even talked about how you could project out, it's one of our further flights of fancy, you could project out some of these contents and start really become obsessed with UFOs and aliens and whatever that may exist in inner space, but there's no demonstrable evidence that they exist in outer space. So there's a connection, even with our most precious outer activities, with this whole inner world. Okay. The final point about all this is that, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to just sort of find the door here, here's the trap door, and jump down there and try to sort all this out? No, we're not going to do that, because this is bigger than us. Okay? It's almost as if we're drawing this out of scale, and we should make the boundary up here and pretend this is the iceberg, and what is it, 9/10 is under the water? Well, I think we're a lot like that. We have a certain amount of ego development, but there's forces down here that are bigger than us, just like there are forces in nature that are a lot bigger than us, and if we go head on with them, we're going to lose. So we sort of have to have a lot of respect for what's happening in this dimension of our psyche and approach it with a certain amount of trepidation. And if we do it in that spirit, we can actually get all sorts of insights, whether we do it from dreams or we do it from these moments of high feeling intensity, or analyzing various events that happen to our life that really strike us. We will gradually develop our own picture of the psyche. We can read Jung, and he's going to show us certain kind of landmarks, but if we never go on the journey ourselves and perceive it in our own psyches, we never will really believe that it's real. Okay? It will still be affecting us, but we'll never really believe that it's down there. And Jung is not asking us to take it on his word. He's saying, you know, go to sleep at night, see what happens. Wake up in the day and try to get through your day with not one upset at all, and see what happens. And then, all right, so what we have here then, let's say, is Jung's science of the psyche. Okay. We also talked about the fact that Jung took this science of the psyche and he kind of wrapped it up with his ideas about, he was so enamored with this process. This was such a great discovery that he says, well, this is really the only way you really know things. And we talked about that as well. If this is the only way we know things, then spirituality, theology, philosophy, they're all reduced to just ways to illustrate Jung's analytical psychology. So that doesn't please us, so we have to take that part of it away, and then we're left with the real core of Jung's psychology, which we can then begin to use. Okay. Let's go over to the other side, and we're going to do spirituality sort of more on John of the Cross, but it fits many of the other things as well. Okay, first, let's call it, again, the ego. And here's God, and here's our various faculties by which we try to draw closer to God. Our thinking, our feeling, our sensation, our intuition. And when John of the Cross is talking about meditation, he is talking about using these faculties in any way, whether we favor the affective side or the thinking side or the imaginative side, or a very simplified kind of intuitive side. He's talking about using all these faculties as ways we can draw closer to God. And he feels that for many people at the beginning of the spiritual life, they are exercising these faculties, and they are kind of feeling connected to God by, let's say, these different channels, and the sweet water of God's presence is flowing down these channels, and they're drinking of it whenever they want. And so that's great. That's how they start, and that's like confirming them in their conversion, where they move away from the things of the world. After that goes on a while, whether gradually or suddenly, this can disappear. And it's what John calls the dark night of sense in the wide sense. And I'll explain that in a minute. But these channels no longer work. You can't draw that energy and that sweet water anymore. And you go around disconsolate, figuring you must have done something, or somehow God is angry with you, or whatever the reasoning is, because this bond is broken. John claims that one possible outcome of that is that contemplation is beginning. This presence of God in a fuller, richer way that could never come through these faculties. It's beginning in the center of the soul, or in the depths of the soul. And if we knew enough to turn around and, instead of doing this, sort of use our attention, what he calls our loving attention, and look down there, look in the depths of the soul, we would see or feel better word is feel, that God is present in a new way, and he's trying to communicate in a new way, and we sort of meet him. Probably the best way to look at it is that this gradually comes up, and we meet him right at this boundary here. And we have a new kind of knowledge and love of God, which is not as distinct. It's not in various images and not in various kinds of distinct thoughts, but it's a richer and deeper, more obscure but richer and deeper. And it is actually a presence of God. It's not just that we believe that God is present to us. We do that all the time. But through that faith, the faith somehow becomes illuminated. This faith, animated by charity, actually becomes the way we know God. It's some kind of knowledge, even though it's very difficult to describe what it is.
I know, 'cause I know.
Something like that, right? Okay. Now, I want to refine this a little, because I believe that there's some interesting issues here. And this will be a way we can begin to bring the two together. But what happens is that this dark night of sense in the wide sense, it happens to many, many people. Okay? Just about, I guess just about everyone, but let's say 75% or 90% of the people who really go through the spiritual life end up in this dark night wondering what happened and how they should deal with it. This is one explanation. John is saying, that this is one possibility to explain why this dark night of sense is taking place. But if you read like his book, The Dark Night of Soul, when he describes this, then he goes on after that to talk about the three signs. If contemplation was always the reason why the dark night takes place in this wide sense, he wouldn't have to use the three signs at all. It would have been superfluous. But he gives us the three signs because there's other ways, could be other reasons why we're in this dark night of sense. And what he explains is that this dark night of sense could take place because of sin, for example. That we just have turned back and we're involved in other things and our spiritual life isn't going well. So that's one possibility. And so he says, all right, you can't meditate as you did before. That's sign one, say. But you shouldn't be drawn to other things either, in the sense of, you have this real attraction for all these worldly things, because that might be an indication of where the problem is. So there's two signs. You can't use your faculties to get to God, but you're not really, glomming onto all sorts of worldly things. Then he gets to the third sign. This is the sign that causes all the problems. Because most of the time we can say, well, I can't pray like I prayed before, and I can't see any reason. It's not like I committed some great sin or I'm really become more worldly than I was before to account for this lack of attraction to God. And so we have two of the signs. But what is the third sign? Now this is where people interpret it in different ways. What I think John is saying is that the third sign is the actual beginning of contemplation itself. Okay? That's the third sign. And that's why it's legitimate in his mind to turn away from doing this, to stop this discursive activity, and turn around and be receptive to what's going on. Now, he'll say sometimes, if you're not using your faculties and you're not receiving contemplation, then you wouldn't be doing anything. Okay? So that's John of the Cross's third sign, I believe, is actual contemplation, or what he calls infused contemplation, which is this mysterious presence of God in the soul in a new way. Okay? All right, now, this is where we end up with another whole way of looking at John, another kind of interpretation, which goes sort of like this. I hope this won't be too much of a caricature, but it says, well, you can't meditate like you did before. You're not called that way, and it's not because of any real sin, and therefore you should turn around and be lovingly attentive, okay? But it doesn't go on in this kind of explanation to say that you'll be lovingly attentive to this experience of contemplation that's being given, It says more like, we believe by faith that God is present in the soul, all right? And we're going to be lovingly attentive to this presence of God we believe is down there in the soul. I hope you see that that's different than the way that, at least I am interpreting John, and I think the way he is. This loving attentiveness isn't the reception of an actual gift that's being given. It becomes an active exercise. We try to exercise loving attentiveness to some gift we hope is down there. Okay? And so people do that, and it becomes a kind of simplified affective prayer. To the degree that it's a practice of loving God and believing in Him and is actively exercised, you really can't find too much to criticize about it, okay? Because you could say it's just another, you could call it another form of meditation in the wide sense that John of the Cross is talking about. But if we say that we're being lovingly attentive and it really doesn't exercise any of the faculties, we're just kind of being passively lovingly attentive, then the question is, to what? Okay? I'm not denying that God is present in the soul for all of us. But we're taking John of the Cross's idea of being lovingly attentive that he developed in relationship to infused contemplation, and we're turning it into some kind of active exercise of contemplation by faith, hoping that that will somehow prepare us for the actual infused contemplation to come. That's a different kind of thing. Why do we do that? Why is this, why is this a popular interpretation that's lasted from the 17th century all the way till today and still being, promoted today? I think we do that because we realize that we have the first and second signs and we don't know what to do, okay? We can't pray like we used to pray, and we can't figure out that there's some reason why we can't do that. And we say we must be contemplatives even though we don't know it. We don't experience it. And so we end up with a contemplation that is just unexperienced contemplation. And then it gets to the point where we'll say there's two kinds of contemplation. There's a active contemplation and there's a passive infused contemplation, and most of us are called to go by that active contemplation. And so here's the goal, and here's the two roads, and they're just two different roads to get to this goal. And we say, well, you read Teresa of Avila, and she's talking about this infused contemplation. And you read John of the Cross, and he's really talking about this active contemplation, or this kind of loving attentiveness we do. But I don't think they're talking about two different things. I think they're talking about the same thing. I think they'd be shocked if someone said they were talking about two different things. They never thought they were when they were together. Okay? So, what I'd like to do is just this kind of loving attentiveness, it can have two meanings, and I think that's the crux of the problem. There's a very valid way in which we no longer can pray in that kind of discursive way that we started out, or the imagery and the sensible contemplation. It's gone, okay? It's gone. But and so we're left in what we think of as the apophatic way, you know, where you're beyond images and concepts and so forth. But I'm leery of turning that into us getting too passive and too receptive to an experience that we have no visible sign, no way of, no indication that it's actually being given, the actual contemplative experience. So I don't like that from that point of view. That kind of pretending we're contemplatives, but we're not contemplatives. We want to be contemplatives. I think there's a way that we can preserve the insight here without doing that, and I'd like to call that the way of faith, and the word, that phrase is used in various ways, but the way I'm going to use it is simply to say that if here's God indwelling in the soul as the Trinity, okay, this God isn't asking us to be contemplatives. If you were to go up, you know, they want to canonize you after you die, they say, well, you know, was Greg a contemplative when, you know, during his life? They will not ask that question. Not particularly. It's a secondary issue. They will ask, what degree of charity did Greg exercise? Because the way you get united to God is through love. Or to put it in another slightly different way, when John of the Cross says the only proximate means of union with God is through faith, he means a faith animated by love. Okay, so we believe by faith that God is present as indwelling in our souls, and we can draw closer to him by faith and love, by the active exercise of faith and love. And we can do that anytime we want. We don't have to call that some kind of contemplation. We don't have to pretend we're not using our faculties in a albeit in a simplified way. We are. We make our acts of faith and love. We do whatever we can do. If God grants that experience of contemplation where it kind of gets up here, you know, it may be that God, you know, we believe God's present in the depths of the soul. It may be he's even present in that way that contemplation talks about, but it's so far down in our souls that it doesn't make its presence felt, and so we really can't say that we are. I think we have to get out of that whole scene and say, the real issue is being united with God, and we can do that as much as we want. Even the people who are blessed with, I believe, genuine contemplative graces, and through this Christian prayer and contemplation forum, I think we've met a few. I think they're in the real minority, for one thing, and you listen to them and you talk to them, and after a while you say, I don't think I need this, because it sounds great, but when you see the kind of problems or sufferings these people go through, sometimes they're horrendous. They really are. It's as if the mountains are higher and the valleys are lower. Or maybe the mountains are higher because the valleys are lower or something. But they go through, who knows, we could even take that kind of thing. All right? And like one of them put it, he had all sorts of experiences. He was a fascinating guy who really had started his Christian life. He hit this dark night of sense, and he just seemed to go on hold for a long time. And it was through the practice of Zen meditation that he rediscovered his spiritual life. He actually had some Zen-type enlightenment experiences, and then it awoke in him this whole contemplative side, okay? And this contemplative side began to express it in actual contemplative experiences. And to boot, he had these wonderful numinous kind of dreams. So you figure, this guy, well, he's blessed with everything. There he is, going on the road of individuation, and he's doing Eastern mysticism and Christian mysticism. And then he describes what happened to him. And what happened to him was all those things disappeared. He knew they had happened, but they didn't sustain him, and he's left out in the desert. The way he describes, he's nailed up on the barn door like a hide being scraped. And this went on for years. And he says the only thing that he could do was exercise faith and love, and that taught him that that was the core that everything up till then was trying to teach him. Okay? We can do it without having to go through all that. Okay? We can exercise that faith and that love whenever we want. It's as simple as that. There's no problem in doing that. We don't have to even worry whether we're contemplatives or whether it may be happening down there and we're kind of listening to see, that'd be fun, that'd be great. But if God wants to give it to us, and we're serious about the spiritual life, I don't think it's not being given because we're not being receptive enough. It's because we're not back here the way John is describing. We'll be more than receptive. We want nothing more than to receive that if he wants to give it. But if he doesn't give it, let's not kind of get hung up on it. Let's just get on with it. And instead of trying to create another kind of contemplation out of whole cloth, so to speak, and foster it off on John the Cross, why not just say that we're allowed to go by the way of faith and love, and ultimately that's the core of all this stuff about contemplation. Okay, now we have one more diagram, and that's simply to put together, here's the ego, and we can then borrow from both sides and use our two skills, our sense of the meaning of the spiritual life and our sense of Jung psychology, to take each problem that comes up. Yesterday we did Marian devotion, and we talked about charismatic experiences, and we talked about the possibility you could look at the dark night, and there could be psychological reasons why the energy left here, and it may call to, let's say that, we could talk about a psychological dark night. And we talked about, scruples and sexual obsession and all these things that don't have to be viewed purely in spiritual terms or purely in psychological terms, but can be looked at in both lights, and then we make better headway. So I don't think there's any area of the spiritual life that is exempt from that. Okay? To give one illustration, we say, well, okay, the spiritual life and theology, all right, the Trinity, all right? We'll say the Trinity, well, that certainly should be exempt from any of this kind of stuff. Well, we're certainly not going to take the Trinity and, like Jung was prone to do, reinterpret the Trinity in terms of a quaternity to make it a more fitting symbol. Okay? Because we don't believe it's just a symbol. At the same time, it's entirely possible that we haven't been conscious enough of the kind of psyche that's receiving this doctrine of the Trinity. And, for example, we could have looked at it as some kind of masculine reality. That has nothing to do with the theology of the Trinity in itself, okay? Because even in the Middle Ages, they were keenly aware that there could be no sex in God, in the Trinity. So it isn't like they're saying that the Trinity is male, but that doesn't prevent the church as a human institution from getting on the human side and viewing God in a masculine way, okay, with all the attendant problems that creates, and then by way of compensation, developing a doctrine of Our Lady that is excessively sweet and the language becomes, super rhetorical. That doesn't have anything to do with the tremendous role that Our Lady plays in the spiritual life, which she does. But what I'm saying is that, it's like we talked about Marian devotion, you put it in the realm of theology, and what you're left with is you can receive these beautiful truths and then kind of cover them up because of our lack of psychological integration. And so we're left with a situation where the Trinity is somehow male, and we're then, by a secret compensation, we're devoting all this energy to a kind of Marian piety that eventually gets swept away because it's just not founded enough. Okay? But it may have served the purpose, especially in a theological world that didn't appreciate the feminine. That was the one outlet, and so they would do these giant tomes, or they would have these, excessively sweet kind of piling up of various devotions to Mary among men who, as celibate theologians or in the general atmosphere of the church, simply didn't have any outlet for the feminine inside themselves, and not much in relationship to women on the outside. Let's not get involved in that, but all right. I think that then what we're doing here then is we're saying that there are many, many problems that we now have not just one way of talking about, but two ways of talking about, and we will be all the richer for it. One other example is that we have groups in the Catholic Church that function sort of like cults, all right? And one of the reasons I think they do that is because all they have is a spiritual vocabulary. And so there's no way to talk about the whole human dimension and the unconscious dimension and all these things, so they treat every problem like you have to analyze it in terms of purely spiritual categories. Okay, so if there's a problem, a conflict of obedience and and group relationships, it's cast in form of, God has really given us the power to be your superiors, and if you do what we say, then you will be doing, you will be on a direct line to obeying God and all these things. And where there can be a core of spiritual truth, it's overlaid with a lot of undeveloped human beings, and we end up with what is a real problem. You just end up, like I said, creating a stretching spiritual language to try to deal with psychological realities.